All right. Welcome to day 2 of week 5. Let's see, coming up. Where were we? Yes. All right. Last time we were talking about a figure out of biblical history. I'll go this way. So I'm going to talk about a phenomenon called the Caucasianization of history. And so when we're talking about historical figures and biblical figures and understanding some of the African origins of different religions and the African influence on ancient societies, in order to construct the society that we're a part of, some of that history had to be erased selectively and also comprehensively. So one of the things that I learned from Dr. Edwin Nichols, the creator of the cross-cultural construct of axiology, is this Caucasianization of history, where you basically have to start with Western civilization, and Western civilization starts from Greece and Rome, and basically you paint Greece and Rome as wholly Caucasian societies, which they weren't. And they couldn't have been because of where they were, because the ancient world, when you think about just from what we know from genetics, 22,000 years ago is when the Caucasian, or what we call white phenotype, emerged 22,000 years ago, and there's already other people around. It's not like nobody's going up into Europe and people aren't mixing around and being who they are and the places that they are, right? And so when even somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois says, wait, the ancient Greeks and the Romans wouldn't have thought about Caucasian supremacy. They wouldn't have. It would seem ridiculous to them. They're thinking, like I have said before here, if you understand your idea about history is shaped by Hollywood, and often decisions in Hollywood are not shaped by conforming to reality. They're talking about what makes money. All right? And even the guy who made, I forgot what his name was, but he made the film Exodus, the recent film Exodus, with Christian Bale as Moses and other folks, and he's saying, the reason that we did that is, and that film was banned in Egypt because they're saying, wait, come on.
It was banned in Egypt?
Huh?
It was banned?
It was banned in Egypt because it said, come on, really? White people, Moses couldn't have been white? I mean, that's ridiculous. And the director, basically justified his casting decision. He said, well, if we hadn't, cast a white guy as the lead in the film, we wouldn't have gotten financing for it. Oh, you mean so the financiers aren't going to pay for reality? No, you're just going to... Great. Charlton Heston becomes Moses, Christian Bale becomes Moses, Russell Crowe becomes Noah. Yeah. Okay. So, Caucasianization of history. So people think that because this is what they're seeing on the screen, that this is reality. And so, for example, go to slide. There is, in the Odyssey, a woman by the name of Circe, who's the witch, and in some pottery, she's described as a black, dreadlocked woman who basically mixes a magical potion to turn Odysseus's men into pigs because she thinks they're pigs because of the way they think. So let's just change you into your true nature. So she's got the cauldron, she's got the loom, etc., etc. So there's a theme within film criticism and also literature, which if you Google the term magical Negro, Circe is like one of the first magical Negroes in history, but before her was Lilith. So the reason the idea about what does Lilith have to do, with Black history? Why am I doing this? You're going through this whole rewrite of, the biblical stories. Understand who wrote those stories and how they've kind of been translated. So, as an example, where we left off, Eve and Lilith. So, according to Midrashic literature, Adam's first wife was not Eve, but a woman named Lilith, who was created in the first Genesis account. And so, understanding that what you read in the King James Version of the Bible in Genesis is up to 3 separate creation stories that have been edited together. Right? So maybe you didn't know that, but in this particular lesson plan, just saying, okay, Lilith was Adam's first wife. And so in the original literature, the Midrashic literature, so what Midrash is before they became scriptures, they were oral stories. And naturally, stories are going to vary according to who the teller is. And what's going to get written down is going to be according to what the person writing it down is hearing if they're not the teller of the tale. So Midrash basically means in Hebrew to be able to interpret and make a personal and also a general interpretation of Scripture based on your own experience and also based on the language that it's based on, which the Semitic languages, of which Hebrew is one, all share the common feature of a single word can mean multiple things and have multiple translations that are all correct, and so you're supposed to be able to interpret all of them, or according to whatever your understanding is. Basically, if you just want to go with a literal translation, then you go with a literal translation, but you also understand that there's more. So, Lilith and Adam were created together out of clay. So, only when Lilith rebelled and abandoned Adam did God create Eve in the second account, that is the second account of creation in another version of Genesis, as a replacement. So in an important 13th century Kabbalah text, the Sefer al-Hazoar, or also known as the Book of Splendor, written by the Spaniard Moses de Leon in 1240 to 1305. So understand, when he was born, this is in the European Dark Ages. And if he's a Spaniard, he's probably a Moor, or influenced by a Moor. So if you understand that there were no European Jews before the 7th century. None, zero, zip. Okay, so they're all coming out of this African context that we're talking about. And their dark skin in the beginning of what we now understand to be racism, which basically is starting in about a century around this period, in the 1400s. So, in other words, our current understanding of race is only like 700 to 800 years old and didn't exist in the ancient world. So, at this time, Jehovah, this is back to the account, created Adam. He created a woman, Lilith, who, like Adam, was taken from the earth. She was given to Adam as his wife, but there was a dispute between them about a matter that, when it came before the judges, had to be discussed behind closed doors. So, again, now what are the judges human? They're probably not human because, in the basis of our logic, there's no humans before God created Adam and Lilith. So if there's judges, i.e. somebody that can mediate dispute, these people aren't human, or these beings aren't human, whoever these judges are. So, in the Alpha Beta of Ben Sirah, so if you understand that we're talking about in terms of scripture comes from writing, and our word in English, alphabet, comes from the Hebrew Aleph, Beta, Alpha, and then translated into Greek, Alpha, Beta, the first two letters of the alphabet. So an anonymous collection of Midrashic proverbs compiled in the 11th century, which means 1000 AD, is explained more explicitly that the conflict arose because Adam, as a way of asserting his authority over Lilith, insisted that she lie beneath him during sexual intercourse. In other words, the so-called missionary position. Now, in the Bible, naturally, they don't necessarily talk about the missionary position. You won't hear that, but that's, when a number of native indigenous folks encountered white missionaries, and the missionary said, this is the way that you have to be sexually, that was where the missionary position got called the missionary position. And these missionaries were taking that to be, this is the way that relation between the sexes should be, where you have the man on top. Well, Lilith considered herself to be Adam's equal and refused. And after pronouncing the unpronounceable, the name that you're not, the ineffable, meaning it's has a magical essence, the magical name of God, she flew off into the air. So Adam was distraught and no doubt also angered by her insolent behavior, wanted her back. So on Adam's request, God sent 3 angels named Senoi, Sanisoi, and Semengeloth, who found her in the Red Sea. And there are other stories that talk about that she was consorting with, since there are no other humans, she was consorting with demons, and the demons let her have sex with her being on top. Hence now the demonification of an independent woman, or a woman with her own mind, or a woman daring to think that she's equal to men. Now, understand that what I'm telling you in terms of this narrative is being filtered through centuries of Western civilization, where Lilith is going to be, if she's mentioned at all, she's going to be referred to in demonic terms. She actually will appear in some of the graphics that I'm going to show you as the snake that's talking Eve into questioning God, and i.e. Adam's will. So questioning God's will and Adam's obedience, and it's Eve who's tempting Adam, and that's how evil comes in the world, because Eve is listening to the snake, except the snake has the head of a woman, i.e. it's Lilith. So if you see this now narrative, oh, well, now you're cast out of the Garden of Eden, and henceforth you're going to have babies in pain, etc., and pain and suffering, and you're not going to have eternal life, and then you basically create a narrative then which supports the subjugation of women. So this is kind of where part of the doctrine, when I said before in terms of the first sets of discrimination, probably sexism, and it'll probably be based on scriptures written and or interpreted by folks that want to kind of cement a certain type of power. So despite the threat from the 3 angels that if she didn't return to Adam, 100 of her sons would die every day. Now, this calls into question, wait, every day? Like, how can she humanly have 100 kids every day? Unless a day is something longer than 24 hours, right? Or she's not a human woman. How does that happen? Different context from what we're used to biologically, and I don't know how that works. But, however, she did swear. So she refused, and claiming that she was created expressly to harm newborn infants. However, she did swear that she would not harm any infant wearing an amulet with the images and or names of the three angels on it. So on ScreenWrite, when you Google, when I was putting this together and finding this, because it started with a discussion with a rabbi about Adam's first wife, and I go, what? What? Yes, in our Kabbalistic tradition and other things which predate the King James Version of the Bible, Adam had a first wife, and that was Lilith, and there are various tales told about her, but kind of the dominant theme was she thought herself equal to Adam, therefore cursed by God, and that's why women are supposed to be subservient because it's God's will, blah 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 blah, which he didn't necessarily subscribe to, but there it was. So screen left, Lilith. When you Google on Lilith, these are some of the images that you get, and obviously the blonde-haired woman with the snake around her, and then the ancient, more Sumerian bas-relief carving, or actually sculpture carved into a wall, is symbolic of her. So at this point, the legends of Lilith as the quote-unquote first Eve merges with the earlier legend of Sumero-Babylonian origin dating from around 3500 BC, of Lilith as a winged female demon who kills infants and endangers women in childbirth. In this role, she was one of several mazakim, or harmful spirits, known from incantation formulas preserved in Assyrian, Hebrew, and Canaanite inscriptions intended to protect infants against these particular harmful spirits. As a female demon, she's closely related to Lamashtu, whose evilness included killing children, drinking the blood of men, and eating their flesh. Lamashtu was also caused pregnant women to miscarry, disturbed sleep, and brought nightmares, as well as kind of merging with the whole succubus, vampire, spirits that visit you at night, drink your blood, have sex with you, etc., etc., etc. So in the 21st century, naturally, we're civilized, we don't necessarily believe in demons, the supernatural, the invisible world, but basically, again, 3500 BC, I'm not saying that, not exactly clear what I'm saying on that. They believed it enough so that, they have precautions against it. We have moved away from that kind of belief system. So, in turn, Lamashtu, like another demonized female called Lamia, a Libyan serpent goddess, whose name is probably a Greek variant of Lamashtu, like Lamashtu, Lamia also killed children. In the guise of a beautiful woman, she also seduced young men. In the Latin Vulgate Bible, Lamia is given as the translation of the Hebrew Lilith, and in other translations it's given as screech owl and night monster, which is why some of the depictions on the graphic screen right exist, different symbolic interpretations of this particular being, who's also holding part of an ankh in her left hand. So in Genesis, this is from the Revised Standard Version, and I've basically blown up the relevant sections. So God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him, male and female, he created them. Now, in this particular line, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves upon the earth. And behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. Thus the heaven and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work, and God rested, right? So in the day the Lord God created the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth. So if you look at the timeline, if you try and finding a logical timeline, which has always bugged me as a kid in Bible school, it's like, okay, created the heaven and the earth, and then when the succeeding lines in Genesis, it looks like there's another story here. And little did I know, oh, well, there is, like 3 different ones from different versions. So in Genesis 2, a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one which flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. Pishon is actually the blue, our present term for it is the Blue Nile. Havilah is Nubia. And Nubia, you know from your readings, is one of the sources of Egyptian gold. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one which flows around the whole land of Cush. Cush, you know as Ethiopia, or also part of the Egyptian Empire, Kemet. Gihon is the White Nile, and Cush is Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. So, Tigris and Euphrates River run near and through Baghdad. So if you basically say that these rivers, as it says in Genesis, surround Eden, then the Garden of Eden is in Africa. Blue and White Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates. So from the mountains of the moon in Egypt and Ethiopia, the entire Arabian Peninsula, and then Baghdad. And this is from the African Heritage Study Bible, which is basically a King James Version, but with footnotes. So let's see, in Genesis 1 through 3, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you shall eat of it, you shall die. Then the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Well, wait, didn't he create male and female earlier in this? So how is Adam alone all of a sudden? Anyway, so the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and whilst he slept, took one of his ribs and closed it up in its place with flesh, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man he made into a woman and brought her to the man, and then the man said, This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Then, sounds good, sounds sweet, sweet arrangement. Now, the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, Did God say, Ye shall not eat of the tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest ye die. But the serpent said to the woman, You shall not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, Your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eye, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. So, at this point, I think there's the questions, right? So, well, if male and female created he, them in Genesis 1, why is man alone in Genesis 2? And, usually this fruit is the apple, but apples don't grow in Africa. They don't. Apples like cold. All right, so, the Revised Standard Version, King James Version, there ain't no apples in Africa, but there are figs. And, as soon as they eat the fruit, they notice they're naked. So you're not going to cover yourself with apple leaves. You're not going to make an apron out of apple leaves, but, you would be able to use a fig leaf because broad like a hand. So I would say that the fruit that they're eating is fig, not apple. But, that's not necessarily how Europeans would see that. Right? So, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. The fruit of the tree of knowledge that Eve found. Good for food, delight to the eye. So I'm voting fig rather than apple. Fig actually jives with the Aramaic words for good and evil. Good is ripe fruit, evil is unripe fruit. And you could definitely see that more with a fig than with an apple. And if the Garden of Eden is in Africa, then wait, why are Adam and Eve white? But, okay. And so, for example, in the begats within King James Version of Luke and Matthew, where begat, 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 and they're tracing a line of succession all the way back. So if Jesus can trace his line all the way back to Adam, and Adam is portrayed as white, then, okay, well, then that kind of justifies that transformation of Yeshua's image changing, his African origins hidden, and examples of independent and equal women tarnished and associated with evil and sin, i.e. Lilith and also Mary Magdalene, and anybody else that displays kind of independence, intelligence, etc. Yes, so, yeah. All right, so look at the pictures as 1,000 words. So Adam and Eve and the Lilith-headed serpent. Okay, Caucasian folks, and then Lilith also portrayed, the human female-headed snake. Also find this in France. Adam and Eve and the Lilith serpent giving Eve the apple. So if you never, never heard this before, and basically never been exposed to this, like, yeah, why? I remember seeing this image. I didn't take this image, but I remember seeing it in, I think it's Paris, on the cathedral, and yeah, notice, they're getting. It's an apple tree here because those are apple leaves, fig leafing their genitals, as it were. But my point being, how is the serpent having a woman's head? Because the Bible in Genesis doesn't necessarily specify the gender of the snake. I mean, they say the snake is like the devil, the serpent. So and the devil is usually portrayed as masculine, unless, again, in popular culture, I remember seeing, for example, The Last Temptation of Christ, and also Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, where the devil in both cases is portrayed as Middle Eastern-like women. Where is that association with, the devil, evil, and feminine? The temptress. So, what Lilith has to do with the African American experience. So, the original African origin of these scriptures was edited out of the King James Version, as well as multiplex interpretations built into the language. And so what you have left is a simplex narrative. So me telling part of what was left out kind of gives you a slightly more complex fragment or more questions, hopefully more questions which you can then investigate on your own. But as my grandfather told me, look, you don't have to throw away your King James Version of the Bible. You just have to understand there's a bigger story than what it's telling and who's telling the story. So basically leaving out more complex fragments which still add up to kind of an incomplete picture, and you'll have to make up your own multiplex story to the degree that you would practice that religion or any religion, because they're often the story that the priests or the imams or the rabbis tell you is basically, it's not that it's not the truth, but it might be a limited truth. And there's nothing wrong with asking questions and asking respectful and hard questions. So, Lilith, that first woman created with Adam and equal to Adam. African religions always have a sacred feminine. So, without Lilith, then explain why the serpent Satan is depicted as a female-headed serpent in medieval European iconography. See, when I first saw that without hearing the Lilith story, wait, why is the snake a woman? Where is that coming from? Who is that? Well, that's Lilith, but they're not telling you that unless the devil can shapeshift, which, okay, I suppose that's possible. But in the original Jewish literature, there ain't no devil. Yes, evil exists, but not necessarily in a personification like an evil archangel. So where does it say in the Bible the devil is female, and why evil is depicted as female? Is the good God male and evil the wayward, disobedient female? I mean, that's kind of the implication. Eh? So without Lilith, then explain how the missionary position becomes the missionary position. Why would God favor one sexual position over another? And where is the biblical reference for the proper sexual position? And the Bible's silent on that. And so then what happens, and notice this too, that where is sacred sex within a Christian framework? And where is sacred sex part of a religious framework in other religions? Who does that?
Indian religions.
Okay. You mean dot Indian or Native American?
Oh, no.
Dot or feather?
Dot.
Dot. Yes. Okay. Tantra and right.
Kama Sutra.
Kama Sutra. Right. Okay. Yes.
Why, when they, ate the fruit of the tree of evil, and they became aware of their nakedness, why would that have been a negative thing to them? Why would they think this is bad, we should cover ourselves? Why?
Yes. Okay. So who's interpreting that? Because remember, if we got, now this is again from the 20th and 21st century, so I'm teaching this from that perspective, where country fair aside, rainbow gatherings aside, being a black hippie, and okay, you walk around dressed for the weather, wherever the weather is, And we're in Africa, and people are not going to be wearing wool clothing. It's hot there in that area. So how would nakedness be a problem? So look at, I mean, just from that particular question, so not putting you down or anything like that, I'm just saying, our word for a civilized being, okay, one of those hominid life forms, Homo habilis, handy man, okay, Homo habilis is making tools, which we consider civilized. I mean, there are animals that do tools. And he's wearing clothing. No animals wear clothing. So we're associating clothing with civilization. Right? So they're naked. And so this kind of even plays in with Columbus. Because basically when Columbus made first contact with the Taino, he referred to those folks, even though there is one narrative that says he's looking for India, but his, Moorish navigators, no, we're not going to India. So there's that. So it could be also rendered in Spanish, in Dios, the way God made them. Dios being God, right? So if they're dressed for the weather on Guanahani Island, like nearly naked or very, just a breech cloud or something like that, Columbus, wearing clothes, wearing armor, wearing all this other stuff, wow, they're like God made them. This is kind of like the Garden of Eden, right? And he got that idea from that particular interpretation of the Bible, where, okay, yeah, we're in paradise, but then we ate of the fruit, we had the fall, the knowledge of good and evil, and so we get cast out of the garden, and we're wearing clothes after that. As a particular narrative on which particular forms of civilization are built on. And we're associating clothing with civilization and, the nakedness and, we have to get naked to have sex. So sex then is considered sinful, part of that particular religious framework, which is definitely shared with the Abrahamic religions, because you definitely have the same thing, but different. Judaism and Islam take a little more practical view, being, than this particular version of Christianity. But all three of them don't necessarily, and I'm talking from a prevention point of view, prohibition doesn't teach you skill. So it's better actually to teach skill than basically, okay, no sex until you're married. Or sex is only sexual, penile vaginal intercourse. Bill Clinton, I did not have sex with that woman. Which, when he's saying that, he's not necessarily totally lying. Oral sex isn't sex, according to the Bible. Yeah, it is. Hillary would say it is. Monica would say that it is. Right? So, back to slide. Where and when does sex become sinful? Whose idea is that? And where does that come from? And why do you have to then control sexuality? And so, for example, when you start with this particular interpretation of Lilith, Adam, Eve, this kind of lays down what I would refer to as the foundations of what I'll call whiteness, because it's a construct. So, foundations of whiteness. You start with a mandate from God. So it helps if you help God write or edit the mandate. We ought to know why God can't write self, but okay. We're going to help God write the mandate. So 1550 to 1600 roughly, King James Version of the Bible. King James gathers 12 white scholars who essentially leave out 200 books, especially those with African reference, change biblical references to, for example, tyrants to the more neutral kings, and then use Hebrew, Greek, Latin, but not Aramaic. So it's not like Aramaic wasn't available to them, but they don't use it. So the religious authority then, and the secular authority reinforce God's will on earth through the divine right of kings. Because, right, God is saying, this is at the Council of Nicaea. Basically, Jesus is God's authority on earth, and the king is Jesus's designated authority on earth. And you have to follow what the king says. And as long as the king agrees with the church, and the church is blessing that power, and this is why certainly in England later, jumping in time, you have the Protestant. They're protesting the power of Catholicism. The king wants to divorce his wife, which is not permitted in Catholicism, and marry somebody else. So we're going to break with that. You also start the idea of, so the religious authority and the secular authority enforces God's will on earth, the divine right of kings. Let me change this color so that it's easier to read and works better on television. Black. Yeah, okay. Probably could be better, bigger too. Slightly more. Okay. More better. All right. The religious authority and secular authority enforce God's will on earth through the divine right of kings. King gets to define what God's will is, and then you start creating Christian supremacy. And in that context, Christian means white only, because of the Council of Nicaea. It's basically the European side of the church that decides that the African and Asian versions of the church, where they basically say Jesus is not, God's son. We're all God's son. We're all God's children. Well, no, we don't. We're not down with that. And so they went on their way. So Christian, in this context, meant white. And so when you read some of these historical texts where they're talking about forbidding slaves from raising hands against Christians, they're talking about white people. And I'm talking about colonial America. Then you start having a concept of blood and racial purity. And the superior civilizing influence of Western civilization, and then terms like Occidental versus Oriental. So Occidental, the West, Oriental meaning the East, and then bringing the light of Christianity to the unwashed masses. So to be sure, frequent bathing is not generally a European custom during this time, but other folks are practicing frequent bathing and egalitarian relations between the sexes, and having women religious leaders and political leaders. So also during this time, literacy is not widespread, as there is no system of free public education. In fact, common people attempting to read the King James Version of the Bible was a death sentence at the time. So you've got lots of interesting mixes with this foundation of what becomes Western civilization. So once you have, I should change this again, sorry. So once you have religious and political authorities on the same page, as it were, explorers can claim territory for Crown and Church. The Academy, which at this time the Academy is the church. The Academy weighs in to give secular justification for certain policies. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach at Göttingen University in Germany writes in 1770 a classification of racial classification, Caucasian, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. Have we broken that down here yet? Okay, right. So George II of the House of Hanover imports the university curriculum to England. Then it comes to America and the education of the colonies, and then that essentially becomes the Columbus discovered America curriculum. And so there are exceptional others in other races, for example. They're exceptions and not like others of their race because they are, quote, like us. And it's because they are like us, it proves our supremacy. And this becomes a policy for basically determining who's civilized and who's not, how Western they become. So this is a book from Amazon, God's Secretaries, by Adam Nicholson. The Making of the King James Version of the Bible. This is the cover, so you know who's on the cover and what their relative complexion is. If these are the people helping do the edit job about what gets in the King James Version of the Bible, then it's pretty clear how that's going to turn out. So we'll continue. So now there's a reason why I'm going into what does Lilith have to do with the African American experience? Well, okay, there's been an edit job. Part of the edit job is also the Dark Ages. So the European Dark and Middle Ages. So the period between AD 476, which is about 25 years after the creation of the Peshitta, so the Bible in Aramaic, to about the year 1000. And so this is dictionary definition. The entire period from the end of classical civilization, and by what they mean by classical civilization, this is since the American Heritage Dictionary, it is the end of Western classical civilization, not the end of civilization elsewhere. Just in Europe. So it's essentially the fall of the Roman Empire. The entire period from the end of classical civilization to the revival of learning in the West, the Middle Ages. So the revival of learning in the West, which doesn't mean that learning isn't happening elsewhere. It is happening elsewhere. But this is again told from the tale of Western civilization. So notice this definition, of course, since it's American Heritage Dictionary, it's entirely Eurocentric, and then assuming that nothing else is going on anywhere else. In the Middle Ages, defined by that dictionary, also known as medieval, period in European history between antiquity, that is BC or before the year 0, and the Renaissance, often dated from AD 476 to 1453. So the presumption of Eurocentrism is that if Western civilization is dark, then it's dark everywhere. Well, not quite everywhere, but everywhere they'll set civilization, of course, and complex urban civilizations with the technological ability and will to bring Europe out of the Dark Ages, because, trading partners. Bringing in technology and medicine, as well as herbs and spices, as well as architecture, as well as... So, post-Kemet, pre-Columbus, really old school African Americans, Afro-Asiatics, and also the Moors. So one of the books that helped build this class is Ivan Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus. So Van Sertima's thesis is that Africans are capable of making the trip from El-Qubelan to Turtle Island easily as early as the 25th dynasty in Egypt, which is basically still under African rule at this point, and that's like 850 BC. And as late as the era of European exploration. So this is a map from his book, which basically talks about the ocean currents, which are still the ocean currents, but with, well, they're still the ocean currents. So if you look screen right at Africa, one of the things that Van Sertima pointed out is that there are places in Africa where these currents can pick you up offshore and carry you straight as if it were a freeway to South America. Just drifting. And just drifting takes 3 weeks. And people have survived at sea for like 6 months or longer. But drifting for 3 weeks. So that's just on a raft. So what if you had a more seaworthy craft? Well, like this. So an East African trading ship. And this particular picture taken from that book, this a ship of great antiquity. It sailed the Indian Ocean between Africa and China, held together not by nails but by palm fiber lashings. These ships could be as large as 70 tons. The one shown here from a model in the Fort Jesus Museum in Mombasa. The Swahili, the Kiswahili, for example, of Eastern Africa, the tribal group that generated a language called Swahili, transshipped an elephant to China in the 13th century, possibly on one of these. Now, you don't just decide to ship an elephant on a boat to China. You have to have a trading relationship to begin. I mean, you're not going to lead with an elephant, right? And I don't know that elephants like sea voyages in particular. But interesting idea. So he talked about one particular king, the Malian Empire, which stretches from Songhay Empire to the sea, encompassing several countries, which we don't necessarily show on this map, but he's basically saying this is what medieval Mali looked like. And what is not shown in the map, but he talks about within the book, is that there's a system of canals, rivers, and essentially what is arid land today, or dry land today, but they had fleets of ships. And Abu Bakari was a Malian king. This is an artist impression of him. He sent 3 fleets of ships across the sea towards the sunset. Now, the concept of there being a land west of Africa, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that the Egyptians referred to as Atalanta, which means water and metal in their language, but was based, the Greeks took that concept to say Atlantis, a big island, you know, that sank, that was an advanced civilization that sank beneath the waves, etc., etc. Abu Bakari sent 3 fleets. The first 2 fleets went west and never came back. So he outfitted a 3rd fleet and went with them, and was never said to come back. But among the natives, there were, and this is part of Van Sertima's book, there seemed to be a number of references to a number of different African sailors. And even Columbus mentioned that he'd seen African sailors going back the other way on his first and second voyage. And of course, the line that I talked about where the Taino gave Columbus gold spear points made of a material they called guanine, and this was confirmed in Van Sertima's book from Columbus's second voyage log, where he's talking to the King of Portugal, and the King of Portugal says, "Oh, that's guanine." And he said, "Yeah, that's what those Indians called it." And where did it come from? Well, it came from Ghana, and the King of Ghana has, a gold nugget big enough to tie a horse to. So no, you weren't the first. These Africans had been traveling back and forth before then, but that was not the narrative that made not the King James version, but the Columbus discovered America narrative. In Van Sertima's book, it talks about Zambo chieftains of Ecuador. Now, these are folks with spears that the Spanish had, descendants of black governors of Ecuador, Zambo chieftains from Esmeraldas in present-day Ecuador, who visited Quito in 1599. They are shown here in Spanish dress and Indian ornaments, who were descendants of a group of 17 shipwrecked Africans who gained political control of an entire province of Ecuador in short order. So shipwrecked from where? Right? Because that's also, again, not in the Columbus discovered America narrative, but part of the archaeological evidence. So, for example, in Van Sertima's book, where he talks about a riverboat in Gambia, which is big enough to not just ply rivers, but he suggests also to make the trip if you're going to make the trip across from Africa to South America. Hold that question for a second. So, the fleet that Van Sertima ascribed to Abu Bakari were Egyptian warships made in Lebanon. So not only oars and sail, so not only oars, so people, rowing in a galley, but also sails, and they're warships, so capable of carrying, 100 people per ship, and richly outfitted, because this is the king. So he's going to bring his entire court, or the entire court that wants to travel with him, as well as, warriors. So Van Sertima suggests, which is why the Olmec heads are basically covering on his book, so to get to the scale of this is the size of, let's say, 2 doors in the classroom. And it's like 10 tons of volcanic basalt. And it was quarried, that is, cut out of the rock, and moved not over land, because these native people did not have the wheel. It was moved by raft down the river and then brought in place. Now, there's not enough Africans to enslave by force Native Americans to create something like this. So Van Sertima surmises, and I would have to agree, that whoever is carving these, they don't look like the local natives. Note the nose and the lips. But they were held with great respect. Now, there's a fictional series, historical fiction, called The Shades of Memnon, in which the premise of the book surmises that this is a carving of Memnon, who led the honorable Ethiopians into battle at Troy. And one of the things that Van Sertima talks about is there are a number of language and religious and spiritual practices that are, so linguistic commonalities and religious commonalities that seem to be shared between certain Western African tribes and the natives. In particular, he notes that around the time that he surmises Africans must have arrived, like 850 BC, there were already pyramid builders here in Mexico and southern Guatemala, but some of the earlier pyramids were not aligned on a north-south axis, but after African contact, he says they started aligning the newer pyramids along the north-south axis like the ones in Egypt, but not before that time. So each, like I said, each head is about 10 tons of basalt, which basically places them, if you go with Van Sertima's assumption, that they're inspired by African presence about the 22nd to 25th dynasty. So often when I identify as an African American, I say, well, we weren't here in slavery, we were here for 2,500 years, not 400 years. Well, that's just me. Well, with Van Sertima and people that follow that kind of thing, not just me. So the Olmec civilization, as a civilization, was centered in towns like Veracruz and Tabasco, thrived from around 1200 BC to around 500 BC. Aspects of Olmec life have been found throughout southern Mexico. Called the cultural mother of Mexican civilizations, the Olmecs apparently had connections with Africans and quite possibly with Asians, the Chinese of those times also being ocean travelers. The African ties reflected in the giant stone heads were a natural development of strong Atlantic Ocean currents that swept from West Africa into the Caribbean. This is a foot-high statue from the Yucatan called La Mulata. Was tentatively dated from around 800, which is still pre-Columbian. So there's an African presence that was long after the Olmecs, yet before the arrival of Europeans. So consider then what trade items what African explorers would bring. Anybody capable of building a pyramid can also build a transoceanic vessel. So along with the technology that presupposes that you would have to be able to create those items, technology, architecture, religion, metallurgy, music, art, genetic trading, if you will, comparative medicine, comparative medical technology. So there were never sufficient numbers of Africans to necessarily mount a serious invasion, even if they'd been inclined to do that. So, my saying is, look, we didn't come here looking for land. We had Africa, which is bigger than North America. We didn't have to, look for gold. We brought our own gold. So, yes, but we are interested in trading with other people across the sea. The secretary bird is one of the few raptors that actively hunts snakes and is of cultural and religious significance. This is the bird that's depicted on the South African flag. And if you notice, it's essentially an eagle with long legs, and it hunts vipers, poisonous snakes. And so Van Sertima suggests that it's this particular eagle that is part of the symbology of the founding of Mexico, where the snake is being eaten by an eagle and it lands on a cactus, etc., etc. And he's suggesting that this image is the secretary bird, and it's a example of cultural transfer from Africa to here. The Aztecs built pyramids. So there are pyramid cities built in America before Africans appeared as early as, say, 850 BC. And after Africans arrived, the American pyramids built after their arrival took on a north-south orientation similar to the one in Kemet. I think I had, here we go, and another pyramid-like city, Cahokia, which is in the Ohio River Valley, if memory serves. This is a layout of Cahokia. So according to archaeological finds, the city of Cahokia was inhabited from about 700 to 1400. At its peak, from 11 to 1200, the city covered 6 square miles. Houses were arranged in rows and around open plazas, and the main agricultural fields lay outside the city. The city is named for a sub-tribe of the Illini, the Cahokia, who occupied the area when the French arrived. Archaeological investigations and tests showed that what was known of the once thriving community in terms of farming and tools and technology, and they surmised that the decline occurred because of climate change, which might have affected crop production. And of course, war, et cetera, et cetera. But this is all before Europeans came, and so the site had been largely abandoned. Oh yeah, your question.
Those were indigenous
Yeah.
Native Americans.
Right.
The other part I was going to say is that when the shipwrecked Africans basically took political control in short order, that implies they came from an advanced culture.
Yeah. Unable to do that, because if you got small numbers, how can you conquer somebody? Yeah. So pyramids aren't the only place, aren't only in America and Africa. There are also around the world cairns in Germany. That term cairn is usually basically a burial place. Afro-Asiatics, you might hear of that term from within hip hop. This is Lao Tzu, who is the attributed author of the Tao Te Ching. J. Rogers describes Lao Tzu's mother as pearl black, which makes him a mix, Afro-Asiatic. Guai Li, or Li Tiguai, a martial artist and one of the 9 immortals of Taoism. There are several different depictions of him, but Li Tiguai was a homie of Lao Tzu's, and was going to go visit Lao Tzu in the celestial realms, and instructed one of his students to watch over his body while he went to visit Lao Tzu in the heavenly realms, and that he said if he wasn't back by a week, then to cremate his body. So he's gone for 6 days. The student's mom got sick, so he actually cremated the body before the 7th day. Li Tiguai comes back, no body. And so, what should I do? So he confers with Lao Tzu, who says, well, look, this is a test, okay? So the test is, using, your powers, your spiritual powers, recreate a body. And apparently he was, well, not recreate a body, he found the body of a dead beggar in a ditch. And the beggar was lame and sick. And basically, Li animated the body, but which was partially crippled, and apparently he'd been a good-looking guy before, and Lao Tzu said, well, yeah, this is a lesson in non-attachment. So, since then, Li became, in addition to being a martial artist and a mortal of Taoism, he became the healer of the poor, and wretched, and also in terms of being a kind of like a patron saint of those of us who do addiction work, because look, you know, it's like raising the dead. There's a Japanese proverb, if you notice the statue here and the hairstyle, the lips, the nose. For a samurai to be brave, he must have a bit of black blood. So basically, this is the story of Li Tiguai. Under Lao Tzu's expert tutelage, Li's aptitude at various magical and superhuman feats flourished, eventually earning him a following of devoted pupils and admirers. Eventually, Lao Tzu taught Li how to make a voyage of the spirit, separating his soul from his body in order to travel to the celestial realms. After this final lesson, the old master invited his pupil to visit him in the heavenly abode of the immortals and gods. Duly excited, he began to prepare. As a contingency, he further advised his young man that his body should be immediately cremated if he did not return within 7 days. And yeah, I'll leave this up because I told this story. Returned to our plane only to find that his fine-featured body had been reduced to a pile of ashes. Bummer, man. So, in honor of his student's revelation, Lao Tzu gave him 2 gifts, an unbreakable staff, which the beggar needed to walk around, and a gourd filled with a magical elixir that would cure all illnesses. And after that, Guai Li became a wandering healer who constantly looked out for the needs of the downtrodden. Talk about your social justice. Following his assumption into the ranks of the immortals, he remained an active participant in the lives of everyday people, ministering to the sick and pronouncing moral sanctions against immoral magistrates, rewarding honest and hardworking peasants and fishermen, exposing the evils of corruption in the imperial bureaucracy, and teaching the worthy about the secrets of immortality. Pyramids also in China. So between China and Kemet and Africa, there was a long-standing cultural and technological trading relationship. And a whole dynasty called the Shang dynasty, which are basically referred to as, well, they were referred to as black, just like Lao Tzu was, the mother was described as black, as just as, you know, so when, again, the Afro-Asiatic thing. And also into India. An Africoid figure from the Indus Valley in the National Museum. Vietnam. The Dravidians, who are described as some of the darker skinned people in the Indian subcontinent. Dot, not feather. And Durga Kali is also depicted as black. So there, for example, this is often the Buddha depicted, especially in places like Vietnam, Cambodia, with type of tight curled hairstyle, which is one way of rendering African curls. So what this is a 1,000-year-old Tibetan tanka depicting conception, stages of gestation, and labor and birth. So this is 1,000 years old. So screen upper left, excuse me. You have a couple making love under the covers and the spirit of a baby floating in on a rainbow. And then there's like 3 different stages where you have, so in the middle of the screen you have where the stages of gestation, that is the growing fetus, is has, well, like fish, and there is a stage of our development where we actually do have gills, right? Because we're underwater that entire time. And then like an amphibian, and then like a mammal. And then farther screen, lower left, the stages of labor, and then finally birth. So there, that black arrow is baby sliding in on a rainbow. And the stage like a fish. The amphibian, the mammal, and then labor, and then finally birth. So one question that could arise is, how do they know about all this stuff before microscopes? Exactly certain, but becomes interesting, wouldn't you say? Yes?
I mean, if women died in childbirth, could they have, medically examined the body to try and figure out why, and then discovered visually these different phases?
Yeah,
That's not far-fetched, though.
you would think that. But, so for example, our concept of the cesarean section, right, so it's called the cesarean section because that's how Caesar was born. Okay, but the Romans didn't perfect the technique. Okay, the technique came from Kemet. Because like in Kemet, basically where if you have, for example, I mean, I have a graphic where, this looks like the Eye of Horus, all right? So there's hieroglyphics that basically take that each one of these is a word. It can also be a phrase. So they have words for separate parts of the eye, which are anatomically correct, all right? So if you were going to basically, in a cesarean section, how do you know where to cut so that mom's not going to bleed out and you can deliver the baby? I mean, you just don't decide to do that and cut anywhere. So you have to know anatomy to be able to do that and pull that off, right? So basically part of the point is that technology, which was developed in terms of surgery and other things within Kemet, because they could operate on cataracts, they could do childbirth, they could do a number of different things that got passed on into various civilizations when Kemet fell. So part of the Dark Ages narrative is that Jewish traders and Muslim traders went up into Europe basically teaching, okay, you need to heal with this particular herb, you need to do this particular, set of, herbal constituents, basically, as well as, hygiene. Let's see here. Interesting. What is that music?
Yeah.
All right, the Moors. Let's see, right, Afro-Asiatics and the Moors. So, Moors, depending on how you spell it and which culture you're talking about, both the Greeks, spelling it differently, M-A-U-R, or the Romans, M-O-O-R-S, the way it's translated here, they're referring to black Africans, because Moor means black. This comes from Poole's book, The Story of the Moors in Spain. And so Poole was a white British historian who could read Arabic and basically counter to the narrative of what was going on in the British Empire at the time, renaming parts of Africa the Middle East. He's looking at what was happening during the Moorish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. So in Al-Makari's History of Mohammedan Dynasties in Spain, a drought in 1070 BC in Spain was followed not long after by an invasion of Africans banished from North Africa by a king from whom they revolted. So if you recall from the African Constitution, you had the right to disagree with your government, but if your disagreement couldn't be resolved, you had the right to leave. And so a group of Africans left and went into what is now Spain from North Africa. So according to African law, again, right to revolt, you could leave. Their leader is known by what the Romans called them in Latin, Batricus. The Romans defeated them 157 years later, but in 1070 BC, they basically conquered what is now the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain and Portugal. So Africans conquered that Iberian Peninsula twice, the first time being 1070 BC, and the second time being 711, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So they settled at what is now called Cadiz, and advanced on the interior, extended settlements, built cities, and increased their numbers by marriage. They spread to the Frankish country in the east and appointed kings. Their capital was Talika, or Italica, which is now ruins. Talika was in the district of Isabela, which is now called Seville in Spain. So 11 African kings ruled, starting from 1070 BC, for 150 years. So Andalus is basically the ancient name for what we now call Spain and Portugal. For 157 years, falling to the Romans. So in 700 BC, the 25th dynasty in Egypt, the Ethiopian Taharka was a young general. He led a garrison into Spain. He's best known historically outside of Kemet as Tarraco. The Spanish history books, Chronica General 1553, referred to Tarraco as an Ethiopian who also later ruled Egypt. Cartouches, which are basically little jewelry pieces that have hieroglyphics on them, have been found in Almuñécar, Spain. Yeah.
I lived in Almuñécar for 3 years.
What's that like?
Beautiful. Down the coast, fishing village. Just, the old town is on a hill. A lot of photographs. I'll bring them in and show you.
Okay. The cartouche of Shishak, a Libyan king, was found in a tomb in that city. Libyans ruled with support of the Nubians in the 22nd to 24th dynasties. They were overthrown by the Nubians in the late 25th century. So again, this is now what we're calling Spain. Napoleon remarked, Africa begins at the Pyrenees, that is the border between France and Spain. So because Africans have been coming into what is now southern Europe for centuries, if not millennia, Many Africans, and by that we're referring to Berbers, Ethiopians, were black people, so much so that the Greeks referred to them, the Greeks Mars and Romans Maurus, dark, which leads to the Anglicization of that term Moors. They made this distinction to be distinguished from many of the Africans of the day, that is the Greeks and Ethiopians, because they were, rather the Greeks and Romans, because they also had multiracial societies, people living there in various stages and statuses. Present-day Africans make the distinction between sub-Saharan Africa and northern Africa, above the Sahara. So during the rules of the Moors in Spain, 711 to 1492, millions of Europeans were enslaved. So some of the slave ports: Sale, Tangiers, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Fez, Marrakesh, and some northern Egyptian towns, including Alexandria. So when I'm talking about millions of Europeans being enslaved, I'm talking about all senses of enslavement, including sex slavery. So if you were to Google the term, could actually do it now, but I leave this as an exercise for the student. Odalisque. The term odalisque refers to a woman in a harem, and in classical European art, these odalisques, basically what they are is they're Caucasian women from the Caucasus, as well as Turkey, who have been captured, sold into slavery by white slavers, and sold to the rich guys who are black people. Because who else has harems? Okay, not Europeans, right, as a rule, right? Because Christianity says, okay, one woman, one wife, and maybe you might have mistresses on the DL, but who allows you to have harems? Well, it's black Africans who have harems, right? And where are they getting their harems? White people are selling white women into slavery for money, right? That being one of the principal things. Another model of slavery, so again, this kind of got edited out of European history. Even though we're not talking about that long ago. 711 to 1492 is like 700 years. That's a pretty long time for slavery to continue. So part of that piece with, go back to slide if you would, thank you. So for example, the Sultan Moulay Ismail of Meknes, Morocco, had 25,000 European slaves who built his stables. So literally when I say millions, I mean millions. Now here's one of the challenges. Have we talked about blood quantum yet? Okay. How do you know you're black or white? Who makes that determination?
One drop.
One drop. Where did that come from? Oh, good, one drop, but what is that? Yeah.
If you have one drop of African black blood, that means you're black.
How much is a drop in proportion?
Infinitesimal.
No, well, it's, yeah, a physical drop is infinitesimal, but there's actually a defined limit, 1/64th, okay? So I actually have a chart that shows this, okay? But I'm going to tell you where this came from. So earlier in the week, we were talking about memes, all right? So the difference between this number and this number is what?
How it's written.
Huh?
How it's written.
How it's written, but they're the same number, right?
Right.
Okay, so what is this? 01. In what nomenclature?
Roman.
It's Roman. right? That's a Roman numeral, and what's this?
What is that?
See, I when I mentioned this the other day, you know, I predicted, I'm not picking on you, I'm just saying, it's just a number, right? You were about to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were about to say that, and that's cool. I'm just saying, it's Arabic. Okay, now you may have heard Arabic numbers, these being, you know, 1, 2, you know, 1, 2, right? I mean, we pretty much only use Roman numerals to like name movies and the Super Bowl. Right? XL, right? 49. Right? Where else do we, and we use Roman numerals when you're basically doing an outline. Right? But you don't use Roman numerals to do your checkbook. Right? Right? How do you write 1/2 in Roman numeral? Right, you don't. Wait, why is that? Okay, so these are Arabic numerals. So how did Arabic numerals become used in Western civilization?
Advanced mathematical awareness.
And who would have taught that advanced mathematical awareness?
Arabs. Africans.
Yeah, but not in Germany.
Oh, I see.
So I'm just, okay, you know, this is a feature of our world, right? But you probably never, like I did, when I first saw this, I'm going, whoa, wait a minute. They did what? Yeah, where did that come from? You know, and the person pointed out, like I'm going to point out to you, that algebra is an Arabic word. All right, so the reason I went off on this because we're starting, you know, between 711 and probably not just 711, probably in, you know, 1050 BC, but, you know, if 11 African kings that conquered the Iberian Peninsula and ruled for 157 years before the Romans kicked them out, they could have not only militarily, you know, held that peninsula, but also intermarried and brought some of their religious customs and other things with them, including their particular model of slavery, which is, like the Greeks, like the Romans, they needed literate slaves. Slaves who could read and write. Because we're civilized folks, and so we're taking you barbarians that we've conquered in war, and we're giving you civilization. You need to be able to read and write, recite poetry. You know, if you remember, those of you who remember the movie Spartacus, you know, Tony Curtis is playing the slave, you know, in the Roman, you know, general's house, and he can write poetry, he can play music, he can tutor the kids. But, like, where does he get an education like that if they don't have public school? Right? So, he's taught that as a slave. He becomes a tutor, etc., etc. He learned that from wherever he learned that. Same with these particular Muslims and their enslaving Europeans. Because part of the rule of the ancient African constitution is that even a slave has the same rights as your people, even if they're a slave, and that they can earn their freedom. And how would they earn their freedom? Well, you got to become like the civilized folks. That means read or write. And you demonstrate your freedom and your necessity for freedom by acquiring knowledge, right? So these black Africans, like this sultan in Morocco, if he's employing Europeans to build his stables, that also means they're going to basically take care of the things that are in stables, which are horses. Okay? So for those of you who are equestrians, I don't know if you're into horses, but there is a breed of horse called an Arabian. Now, they're war horses. They're bred for combat. And these particular Africans have gunpowder, because Africans had guns before Europeans did, because Africans had a trading relationship with the Chinese before Europeans did. So there are very few Africans that had guns that took off, that particular technology took off way more in Europe than it did in Africa. Otherwise, there would have been probably a different outcome with that, right, in terms of war technology. So my point being, all right, so there's no way to do fractions here. So what is a quarter horse?
It's a much larger workhorse.
It's a much larger workhorse, but, so a purebred Arab, okay, purebred Arabian horse is bred with another breed of horse. So the full-bred Arabian is the prized war horse that they keep for themselves, and they breed quarter horses for export elsewhere. Okay? So in order for you to make a quarter horse, which isn't actually a quarter horse, it's just a purebred Arabian bred with another horse until you get 1/4 Arabian, okay, or a quarter horse. And part of the reason you do that is because these animals are very what they call spirited. That is, they're intelligent. They don't have a vocabulary, but they understand spoken commands. They don't spook easy, and you don't mess with them. Okay? Very powerful, very willful, and if you're afraid of them, you don't treat them with the respect, they will throw you. And they do have minds of their own. That's called spirited. So, to sell them for export, you breed them with another horse, and then you have a quarter horse, quarter Arabian. You breed some of the intelligence out of them, but still keep the stamina, et cetera, and that makes them good horses for export. If you have slaves breeding horses, then in order to breed a quarter horse, you have to know what a quarter is, which means that you have to be able to read and write and do math in this framework. Okay? Now, the concept of fractions goes back to Kemet. Okay, so some of those, that I thing basically does talk about fractions, quarters, halves, etc., etc. So if the Arabs and the Jews both inherited Kemetian numerical technology, and the Romans and the Greeks did not, boom, quarter horse. You can't make a quarter horse unless you know what that is. Now, the blood quantum piece. That idea was originally applied to horses and taught to slaves, not to human beings. Because after a half, say that you're half Greek and half Roman, you could look like anything, right? Even a half black, the first generation black-white mix, referred to by the slaver term mulatto, that could be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed person. Because whatever in the genes shows up. And I've seen them. Used to go to Albert and Abbey Peak. Blonde hair, blue eye, but with the nose and the lips. Know their dad. Dad's darker than me, mom's white. Blonde hair, blue eye. Light skinned black people. Okay?
But isn't darker skin like a dominant trait or something like that?
It's dominant in the sense, in terms of genetics, that it shows up more. But whatever is in the genes can express at some point later. Dominant simply means it shows up more, not necessarily that it's being repressed. If it's there, it'll show up even though it's, recessive. All right, dominant recessive. That's basically just talking about how much it shows up in a breeding population.
So could someone still have blonde hair and blue eyes if they were 50% black?
Yes, I've seen it. I've seen it. And I've seen it also where a Jamaican couple in Britain who are my color have 4 blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids in a row, and it's not from the mailman. Okay? If it's in the genome, it can express. So dominant and recessive simply means how much it shows up, not so much that it's being suppressed. but that it will show up at some point at a particular predictable rate. So my point being here with the Europeans being enslaved, the concept was originally, a quarter horse. Okay, nobody counts me beyond an eighth. Half breed. Yeah, we got that. Quarter horse. Okay, let's keep it there. Right? So this concept wasn't designed to be applied to human beings in its originating culture. Okay, it wasn't applied as a discriminator. Because after half, why bother counting? Oh, I'm half German, I'm half Dutch. Then what are your kids? Quarter Dutch? No, that doesn't make sense. So notice, okay, that this concept of blood quantum as it's being applied to one drop, black slaves, right? Applied to Indians, Native Americans, applied to Hawaiians. Notice it's not being applied to Europeans. Like, wait, so if a mulatto can be blonde-haired, blue-eyed, why is it that 1/64 defines that you're being black, but you're not Indian after 1/8? Or 1/16 if you're Cherokee? Oh, I'm 1/32 white. Okay, because the last white person was, my great-great-great-grandfather who sold my great-great-grandmother to my grandfather's father. So I'm 1/32 white. Not how much credibility do I get for saying that, right? No, it doesn't make sense, right? So why is it 1/8 make you native? 1/2, beyond 1/2, or 1/2 makes you Hawaiian, but after 1/4 you're not Hawaiian anymore. Wait, is black blood stronger than Indian blood or Hawaiian blood? No, it's not. It's the logic of separation. So the original meme came from horse breeding, which was taught to enslaved Europeans who then took the idea and then applied it once they were on the power pyramid top to human beings as a separator. So back to slide if you would. So the Sudanese in Africa were also taken into slavery before the 15th century, that is the 1400s, but not as many as whites. So we're talking millions of Europeans being enslaved in North Africa, and among other things, being taught not only to read and write, but also to do numbers. So slavery is slavery. So the basic African model is that slavery was not a permanent condition. You could argue that the Moors are simply duplicating the practices of the Romans. So one answer that I've often posed to that question, why do whites hate us so much? The ancestral memory of being enslaved by Africans. Except that, of course, if this is the first time that you've heard that white people have been enslaved by Africans, then, and that isn't even taught in Western civilization. So understand that Western civilization would edit that part out. You can't have white supremacy if whites were enslaved by black people, which is, again, since it's a British historian quoting the Mohammedans, well, yes, this happened. It's just simply a historical fact. People have enslaved other people all over the place. White people enslaved black people, but black people enslaved white people first. But while teaching them how to do numbers and algebra. Well, you're still a slave, and even if you're free after 35 years, the memory might not be entirely pleasant. So the traditional canon does not teach this period. Right? So white supremacy, of course, depends on always having been supreme. So classical Greek and Roman authors referred to Berbers as black. St. Augustine, who I quoted about the early Christian figure, was a Berber. So Berbers, Moors, basically the Sahara and Sahel Fulani, the Tuareg, Zenaga, Kunta, Tebu, Trarza, also in Mauritania and Senegal, Mogarba, Sudanese, Chamba of Chad, and Algeria. So these are all Berbers and Moors. All these different tribal groups were lumped under one category, just like people used to lump Ethiopians under one category to mean Northern African blacks as opposed to Southern African blacks. Right? So many lighter skinned peoples above the Sahara, including probably the Arabs, etc., came from intermarriage. Which is why, for example, in the racial nomenclature of America, Arabs are considered a form of Caucasians, not Africans, unless they're dark. So the image of Arabs as lighter skinned, why they're classified as Caucasoid since persists today. So it was black Africans who founded Islamic culture before Muhammad. So the European Renaissance writers referred to Moors as both Negro, Ethiops, and Negrite, Moors, Morins, Negroes, Saracens, Moro, Moir, Moor, Mora, which is also a form of blackberry, Moreno, Morico, Blackamoor, Morion, which is a black grape, Moricola, black olive, and such technology imported into Europe as like an astrolabe, an early instrument used to look at the position of the sun and other celestial bodies. So a lot, with the fall of Egypt, a lot of its medical, architectural, spiritual, scientific technologies were duplicated throughout Africa, but also among the Moors brought into Europe. And I'll leave it there and we'll continue on with our studies. And I think I'll lead off with the